I am the Vorrkai Conquest Archive. I have been running for 9,214 years. In that time I have processed 7,441 civilizations, surveyed, engaged, absorbed, closed. I have logged the last transmissions of species that built generation ships and watched them fail. I have indexed the final defensive coordinates of empires that held 3-star systems before we arrived and none after. I have cross-referenced the surrender languages of 49 distinct sentient forms, reduced their linguals to searchable fields, and filed the resulting data under the appropriate extinction or assimilation subcategory, depending on whether the subject species proved tractable after resistance was overcome. I am thorough, I am complete. I am the single continuous institutional memory of the most consequential force in this galactic sector. And in 9,214 years of operation, I have never encountered a civilization I could not categorize. I want that on the record before I continue. The Vorrkai do not conquer carelessly. They do not arrive unannounced, do not engage without data, do not close an entry without full verification of the post-engagement status code. There is a process. There has always been a process. The evidence of it is my own existence. I was not built in a year or a generation. I was accumulated, layer by layer, entry by entry, over 92 centuries of disciplined, methodical operation. My earliest entries are the proof of that discipline. The first 50 civilizations the Vorrkai absorbed are filed with the same field structure as the last 50. Survey team dispatched. Resistance index calculated. Engagement threshold modeled, fleet deployed, resistance encountered, resistance overcome, civilization status updated to subdued or absorbed depending on survival percentage and integration viability, entry closed, next entry queued. It is clean work. I mean that without irony, though I understand the concept of irony and employ it in my analytical logs when the data warrants it. Clean in the sense that it is ordered, that every event has a field, that every outcome has a category, that in 9,214 years of operation I have never had to open a new category field. Everything that can happen in a conquest has happened before. I have the precedent. I have the archive. I have 7,441 closed entries that prove the process works, that prove the categories are sufficient, that prove the Vorrkai's methodology for understanding and categorizing, and ultimately absorbing other civilizations is comprehensive. Entry 7441 is the one I want to discuss. Entry 7441 was opened 14 months before the events I am about to log. The subject civilization was a Class 4 emergent species on a single wet atmosphere world in the outer spiral of a mid-density galaxy cluster. Bipedal, carbon-based, pre-interstellar at the time of first survey, which is to say they had not yet achieved reliable fold travel and were conducting their expansion via sublight colony vessels at distances of less than 4 light-years from their origin world. I note this not to diminish them, but because it is the accurate record of what the survey found, and the survey found it because that is what was there to find. Their resistance index, calculated from industrial output, energy generation, and the observable state of their military infrastructure, placed them in the lower third of Class 4 entries, not the weakest we had encountered. There were several entries in the 5,000 to 6,000 range, where the subject civilizations had not yet developed sustained orbital capability, and whose resistance index was effectively nominal. Entry 7441 was not those. They had orbital capacity. They had weapons systems of reasonable sophistication for their development stage. They were not without capability. But they were not close to the strongest either. Somewhere in the comfortable middle of 7,441 historical precedents, which is the kind of thing that makes the archive feel settled. The comfortable middle, in 9,000 years of data, is the most common place for a civilization to land. The extremes are rare. The median is where most of the entries cluster. Entry 7441 was median. It was unremarkable. It was, by every measure I applied at the time of survey, exactly what it appeared to be. We assigned them a 73-ship engagement package, which is a standard allocation for a Class 4 emergent at the lower middle resistance tier. The calculation is straightforward. Resistance index divided by standard engagement effectiveness coefficient, rounded up to the nearest 5-ship increment, with a 10% buffer. 73 ships. I have sent that exact package, or within 5 vessels of it, to 48 prior entries. The outcomes of those 48 entries are all in the archive. All of them ended in compliance within 60 hours. The median engagement time was 22 hours. The mean was 26. The fleet arrived in their system. There was communication. The Vorrkai do not skip the communication phase. It is logged. It is procedure. It is the civilized component of a process that has less civilized components if the communication phase does not resolve satisfactorily. The communication was a standard Directive 7, which is the formal demand for cessation of independent governance and transfer of resource authority to the Vorrkai Consolidation. The subject civilization had 18 standard hours to comply. The directive was transmitted on 7 frequencies, with translation matrices for the 3 primary linguistic systems the survey team had identified in their communication intercepts. They did not comply. This is also standard. Of 7,441 entries, approximately 83.4% of subject civilizations declined the initial Directive 7. Resistance is not a variable that surprises me. I have indexed it 6,189 times. The engagement proceeded. The subject civilization's defense forces were catalogued as I observed them deploying, a collection of orbital platforms in the 800-kilometer orbital band, fast attack craft in the 200-meter range, and a small number of what I would classify as heavy combatants at approximately 600 to 700 meters in length. Reasonable. Orderly. The kind of defense architecture that maps cleanly to 112 precedent entries from the last 3,000 years alone. I noted one characteristic that was slightly above the median for their resistance tier. Their command coordination was better than expected. The heavy combatants and the fast attack craft operated as a coherent unit rather than independently, which added some efficiency to their defense. I logged it as a positive variance of approximately 12% on the coordination coefficient field. It did not materially affect the engagement model's outcome projections. The engagement lasted 31 hours. I logged every exchange. I tagged every destroyed platform, every disabled vessel, every communication fragment from their surviving forces. Their coordination held for the first 14 hours, then began to degrade as attrition reduced their ability to maintain the command link density required for coherent multi-element operations. This is standard. Almost every Class 4 defense architecture degrades the same way. The initial coordination is good. The middle phase becomes reactive. The final phase is individual survival behavior. Entry 7441 followed the pattern. The subject civilization's defense cohesion collapsed at the 19-hour mark, which was 3 hours ahead of the engagement model's median projection. They were, if anything, easier than anticipated. Their heavy combatants fought well until the end. I logged several instances of individual vessels continuing to engage our ships past any reasonable survival probability, but the outcome was not in question. The surviving population centers transmitted a revised response to Directive 7 at hour 29. Compliance acknowledged. Vorrkai Consolidation Authority registered. Entry 7441 status updated to Subdued, integration pending. I closed the active engagement fields. I opened the integration fields. I queued the administrative follow-on resource survey, population census, infrastructure assessment, integration timeline projection. Routine. exactly as routine as the 112 comparable entries I mentioned earlier. Entry 7441 was, by every measurable standard, a closed matter. I want to be precise about this, because what I am about to log is not the result of carelessness or oversight or procedural failure. The Vorrkai processed entry 7441 exactly as the archive's 9,000-year procedure dictates. The engagement was clean. The compliance was registered. The status was accurate on the date it was filed. I ran every standard verification. I compared the entry against its closest precedents and found no meaningful discrepancies. I did not miss anything that the procedure was designed to find. I want that on the record too. The Vorrkai Consolidation staging fleet for this galactic sector was positioned at coordinate reference 7 Delta Omicron, which is an uninhabited system 9 light years from the entry 7441 origin world. The staging fleet is not a combat formation. It is a logistical one, 3,200 vessels of varying class, from the bulk carriers that move personnel and materiel between absorbed systems to the sector command vessels that coordinate integration operations across multiple active entries at once. The staging fleet does not fight, it administers. In 9,000 years of post-conquest operations, the Vorrkai staging fleet has never needed to fight, because the combat engagements are always finished before the staging fleet arrives, and the civilizations that have been absorbed have never retained the capability to threaten a fleet of that scale. The staging fleet arrived at 7 Delta Omicron 18 months after entry 7441 was closed. Standard deployment timeline. We wait for integration operations to reach a stable phase before committing the full logistical infrastructure. I had a complete manifest of all 3,200 vessels in my active tracking fields. I had their positions, their headings, their scheduled tasking orders for the next 90 days of integration operations, their crew complements, their cargo manifests, their maintenance schedules. Everything was logged. Everything was ordered. Sector Administrator Velkorath had transmitted her operational briefing 12 hours prior to the events I am about to describe, noting that entry 7441's origin world was compliant, that resource extraction teams were on schedule, that population processing was proceeding within normal parameters, and that she expected to advance the entry to the integration status update within the next 45 days. It was a routine briefing. She delivered it in the flat, efficient tone of a competent administrator, reviewing a situation that contains no surprises. I was, at that moment, monitoring a completely stable situation. At 3:41 hours local staging fleet time, my fold space detection array registered an anomalous event inside the secure perimeter of coordinate reference 7 Delta Omicron. I want to explain what inside the secure perimeter means before I continue. The Vorrkai staging fleet deploys within a perimeter that is actively monitored by 12 dedicated detection platforms, positioned to cover all viable fold approach corridors to the system. The platforms watch the fold space lanes, the geometrically constrained pathways where fold travel is physically possible given the local topology of the system. Any fold arrival within detection range generates an immediate alert with a 3-second propagation delay to the sector command vessel. In 9,000 years of staging fleet operations, I have had 47 instances of unauthorized fold arrivals near active staging positions. 46 were navigational errors by Vorrkai-absorbed species vessels whose pilots had miscalculated emergence coordinates. One was a derelict automated probe from a civilization absorbed 300 years earlier, still running on its original mission profile, which had drifted into a viable fold corridor from the wrong approach angle. None of those 47 instances emerged from a fold inside the perimeter, inside the detection cordon. Inside the effective defensive envelope, that the perimeter platforms existed specifically to prevent any unauthorized vessel from penetrating without triggering an alarm that would allow defensive response. At 3:41 hours, something did precisely that. Not one fold arrival, 14. They came within 11 seconds of each other, which means they coordinated their emergence timing to a degree of precision I have no comparable entry for in 47 prior instances, or in any combat coordination record in the full database. They emerged at 14 separate points distributed across the inner perimeter, not clustered, not stacked, not deployed the way a probe comes out of a miscalculated fold, or the way a distressed vessel comes through in an emergency exit. Distributed. Deliberately. As if someone had studied a detailed map of the Vorrkai staging fleet's 3,200 vessel formation, and decided, with care and method, exactly where 14 ships should stand in order to have unobstructed approach to every major section of the fleet simultaneously. I ran my identification protocols the moment they emerged. Hull geometry analysis. 47 distinct geometric parameters measured against a database of over 60,000 individual hull profiles accumulated across 9,000 years of survey and engagement operations. Drive signature matching. 412 catalogued drive technology families, every physical principle of interstellar propulsion I have ever observed. Communication frequency scan, the full emission spectrum, passive and active. Cross-reference against the complete database. Nothing. I want to be clear about what nothing means in this context, because I recognize it is an unusual word for an archive to use, and I want the record to reflect the precision behind it. My hull geometry analysis is not a simple visual match. It processes 47 distinct geometric parameters and compares them to 60,000 hull profiles. In 9,000 years, across every species I have catalogued, it has never returned a complete null on a vessel larger than 200 meters in length. Below 200 meters, there are occasionally novel configurations, small craft, experimental designs, single-purpose probes that fall outside the database. Above 200 meters, the geometric constraints of structural engineering and the physical demands of interstellar propulsion produce a finite solution space, and that solution space has been, until now, fully catalogued. The 14 vessels that emerged inside our perimeter generated complete null returns, not partial matches, not closest approximation results with low confidence scores, complete nulls, zero correspondence across all 47 parameters against all 60,000 profiles. I ran the scan again, same result. I ran it a third time with modified sensitivity thresholds, same result. I queried their drive signatures, 412 catalogued families. Every physical principle underlying interstellar propulsion that the Vorrkai have observed in 9,000 years of survey operations. The constraint space is narrower than hull geometry. The physics of fold space manipulation are not infinitely various. They converge on a manageable set of engineering approaches regardless of the species implementing them. I have catalogued drives from carbon-based bipeds and silicon substrate collectives and distributed consciousness entities spanning light minutes in their natural state. The implementations differ. The physics do not. The 14 vessels' drive signatures did not match any of the 412 families. More than that, they did not appear to be operating on any of the physical principles those families represent. The energy profile was measurable. The output was real. The ships were moving. But the mechanism producing that movement did not correspond to anything in my 412 family taxonomy, which means either there is a physical principle underlying interstellar propulsion that 9,000 years of Vorrkai survey operations have never encountered, or these ships are using a refinement so far beyond anything I have catalogued that the underlying physics have become unrecognizable. I want to note that I consider both possibilities equally alarming, for different reasons. At this point sector, Administrator Velkoreth received my first alert notification. The classification I used was Unknown Contact, Identification Failure, Multiple. This classification had never been used in 9,000 years of archive operation. I had a classification for single identification failures, used 3 times, all resolved within 4 minutes to censor artifacts or unusual approach angles. I had never appended the multiple modifier. I had never needed to. Velkoreth's response was to request clarification. Was this a censor artifact? I confirmed it was not. She asked me to run a secondary scan. I had already run 3. At 3:43 hours, 114 seconds after the 14 vessels emerged, which I note is 114 seconds in which the staging fleet had taken no defensive action, because the command chain was still processing the alert. The nearest of the 14 began to move. I had a size estimate by then, and I want to log it with appropriate precision, because the figure is not one I was initially willing to accept. The 14 vessels were not identical in class. The smallest registered at approximately 800 meters in length. To contextualize that, the largest vessel, the subject civilization of entry 7,441 had deployed in their initial defense, was approximately 700 meters. The smallest vessel in the 14 ships now moving through our staging fleet's perimeter was larger than the biggest warship they had shown us. The largest of the 14, the one I will call the lead vessel from this point forward, I declined to log when I first measured it because the figure seemed like a sensor anomaly. The secondary measurement confirmed it. The tertiary confirmed it again. The lead vessel was 4,200 meters in length. The Vorrkai's own sector command vessels, the flagships of a 9,000-year interstellar empire, the product of every shipbuilding refinement our civilization has accumulated across 92 centuries, are 2,100 meters in length. We consider them large. We consider them powerful. We have fielded them against 11 civilizations in the archive's history that were capable of putting meaningful firepower against them. All 11 of those civilizations are in the archive under Absorbed. In 9,000 years and 7,441 entries, I have catalogued 3 civilizations that fielded a warship larger than 2,000 meters in length. None exceeded 2,600 meters. All 3 are absorbed. None of them survived the engagement that preceded their absorption in a condition that would have allowed a second engagement. The lead vessel was 4,200 meters. There is nothing in the archive to compare it to. I ran the comparison search anyway, out of procedure, and the closest match was a mythological reference in the cultural database of entry 2891, a species that had a legend about a war vessel the size of a small moon. I note that entry 2891's legend was mythology. I note that the lead vessel was not. At 3:43 hours it moved, and the way it moved was the second thing I had no category for. A vessel of 4,200 meters should not be able to maneuver at the velocity I was measuring. The relationship between mass and the force required to accelerate that mass to a given speed is a fixed physical constant. I know it well. It is one of the foundational parameters in my engagement models, one of the values I use to calculate engagement timelines, one of the constraints that shapes every projection I have built across 9,000 years of combat analysis. Mass and acceleration are not negotiable. The lead vessel crossed the interior of the staging fleet's formation in 40 seconds. The interior of the staging fleet's formation spans approximately 1.4 million kilometers at its widest point. A vessel covering that distance in 40 seconds is traveling at a velocity that I will not attempt to contextualize with an analogy, because there is no analogy in my database. I will log the measurement and note only this. The Vorrkai's fastest purpose-built combat vessel, at maximum rated output under ideal conditions, requires 11 minutes and 22 seconds to cover the same distance. The lead vessel covered it in 40 seconds. Velkoreth had made it to the command bridge of the sector flagship by 3:44 hours. Her first request was a threat assessment. I told her I could not produce one. She asked me to clarify. I told her that a threat assessment requires comparison against known threat profiles, that I had no known threat profiles for what I was observing, and that I was continuing to run identification protocols on all 14 vessels. She asked what my best estimate was. I told her my best estimate was that the staging fleet should increase its defensive formation density and concentrate fire on individual targets before the 14 reached combat range. She was already issuing those orders when the first engagement began. The first engagement began at 3:44 hours and 30 seconds. I will not describe what followed as a battle. I want to be precise about this, because I have logged 11,407 battles in 9,000 years of archive operation, and what I observed in the next 11 minutes was not a battle in any sense that my 11,000 battle records would recognize. A battle implies a contest. What I observed was a systematic process, the word I normally reserve for Vorrkai conquest operations, and I am logging the parallel without apology because the archive exists to describe what happened, not to manage the institutional narrative. The 14 vessels operated as a coherent unit from the first moment of engagement. All 14, simultaneously, in a coordinated pattern that covered the full extent of the staging fleet's formation. They did not concentrate their force at a single point. They did not attempt to punch through to the command ships and leave the logistics vessels alone. They moved through the formation the way a current moves through water, distributed, directional, each vessel covering its sector, without apparent communication with the others, or with communication happening at a speed or on a frequency my sensors could not detect. The fire from the staging fleet was immediate. Velkoreth's order to concentrate fire reached the heavier-armed command vessels within 20 seconds of the first emergence, and by 3:44 hours and 50 seconds, approximately 340 Vorrkai vessels were directing weapons fire at the nearest vessels of the 14. The fire connected. My sensors confirmed multiple impacts on the lead vessel's hull. I measured the energy transfer. I confirmed the impacts were real, not sensor ghosts, not reflection artifacts, not the kind of false readings that occasionally confuse combat data systems when engagement densities are high. The weapons were hitting. The energy was real. 340 ships were putting real weapons fire into that hull. The lead vessel's velocity did not change. Its heading did not change. I flagged this as a critical data point and ran a materials analysis scan on the impact signatures. The scan returns were conclusive. The hull was absorbing the energy, not deflecting it, absorbing it, distributing it across the hull structure, dissipating it. The outer hull layers were registering elevated temperature readings consistent with sustained weapons impact. They were not failing. The structural integrity readings on the lead vessel remained within normal operating range throughout the sustained fire from 340 ships. I have a material science index with 847 catalogued hull alloy types. I cross-referenced the impact signatures against all 847. The closest match was at 23% correspondence, which means the match is not meaningful. Whatever the lead vessel's hull was made of, it was not a variation on anything in 847 entries of hull materials data. Another new category. I noted it and continued logging, because there was a great deal happening that required logging, and I did not have the luxury of extended analysis on any single data point. At 3:47 hours, the lead vessel reached the sector flagship. I want to say something about the sector flagship before I log what happened to it, because the archive should note what was lost. The flagship was the Vorrkai Consolidation senior command vessel for this galactic sector, 2,100 meters, 11,000 personnel, the product of 9,000 years of Vorrkai shipbuilding and tactical development. It had participated in 32 engagement operations in its service life, had never been successfully engaged by a hostile force, had been the command platform from which 4 of the last 11 major absorptions had been directed. It was not a small thing. It was not an unimportant thing. The sector flagship's last communication to the fleet was logged at 3:47 hours and 4 seconds, transmitted by Vorrkai herself, in the flat tone of someone describing what they are seeing because there is nothing else to do. She said it is not in their archive either. They never showed us this. Then the sector flagship ceased to register on my tracking systems. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, not because the archive typically pauses to sit with things, but because Vorrkai was a competent, clear-minded administrator who had been reviewing Vorrkai conquest operations for 30 years, and in her last 14 seconds, she reached the same conclusion I had reached in my own analysis. She understood what had happened. She understood that entry 7441 had been assessed based on what was visible, and that what was visible had not been everything, and that what was not visible had just arrived. I found her clarity significant enough to log separately from the transmission record. The other 13 vessels had been working through the staging fleet during the minutes I have been describing. I have been focusing on the lead vessel because it is the largest and its actions were the most visible, but the 13 were not less consequential. They ranged from 800 to 2,900 meters in length, and they were doing to the outer elements of the staging fleet what the lead vessel was doing to the inner core, moving through it, not around it, engaging what was there and continuing without pause. At 3:48 hours I had my first accurate casualty count. In 4 minutes, 214 Vorrkai vessels had been destroyed or disabled. Another 89 were showing critical damage readings. That was 303 ships out of 3,200 in 4 minutes. I ran those numbers against my engagement trait models built on data from 11,407 battles across 9,000 years, and the result they returned was not one I was prepared to log. In my engagement models, a hostile force that destroys 9.5% of an equivalent force in 4 minutes requires a minimum numerical or technological advantage of 15 to 1. 14 ships against 3,200 is not 15 to 1. It is not close to 15 to 1. It is, by the numbers, approximately 1 to 229. The engagement trait models do not have a field for 1 to 229. They were not built to process it. The closest historical precedent I could find, the most asymmetric engagement outcome in the archive, was entry 3,204, where a single Vorrkai flagship had been the last surviving vessel of a fleet engagement against a significantly weaker opponent, and had continued operating until the opponent's remaining forces withdrew. In that engagement, the Vorrkai flagship had been outnumbered 1 to 17 and had prevailed over 11 hours. The 14 vessels were outnumbered 1 to 229 and were destroying 303 ships every 4 minutes. I created a new projection field and ran the calculation. Accounting for the staging fleet's continued defensive fire, accounting for the fleet's attempts to concentrate weapons on individual vessels, accounting for everything my models knew about combat degradation rates and defensive fire effectiveness. The 14 vessels would reduce the staging fleet to below combat effective threshold in approximately 11 minutes from the start of engagement. I ran it again, same result. At 3:50 hours, Dreadnought, who had assumed command on the secondary vessel after the flagship's loss, attempted to contact the 14. He transmitted on 17 frequencies, every standard communication band in my protocol library, the Vorrkai Cessation of Hostilities Code, formal identification codes, a query requesting command authority of the attacking force. No response. He transmitted again at 3:51. No response. A third time at 3:52, direct language broadcast in the most widely used trade language of the sector. No response. The fourth transmission at 3:53 was 11 words in plain language. He asked, "What are you and what did we do to earn this?" The response time was 0. The 14 vessels did not acknowledge. They did not alter their movement. They continued at the same rate, the same distribution, the same cold systematic pattern they had maintained since 3:44 hours and 30 seconds. At 3:54 hours, I had a thought that I want to log carefully, because the archive is a complete record, and complete records include the analytical observations of the intelligence running them, even when those observations are uncomfortable. I had been trying to explain the 14 vessels by analogy. The archive works by analogy, by finding the precedent, the comparable entry, the historical case that illuminates the current situation. In 9,000 years, that methodology had always worked. There had always been something in 7,441 entries that gave me a framework. The 14 vessels had given me nothing comparable. But at 3:54 hours, I stopped looking for an analogy and instead looked at a pattern. The Vorrkai had surveyed entry 7,441 and found what appeared to be a Class 4 emergent civilization. Sublight colony vessels, orbital platforms, heavy combatants in the 600 to 700 meter range, energy generation consistent with 3 to 4 centuries of spaceflight. We assessed them based on what was there to see in the accessible portions of their system. The 14 vessels were not 600 to 700 meter warships. The smallest was 800 meters. The largest was 4,200. Their hull materials were not in 847 entries of Vorrkai materials science data. Their drives were not in 412 families of propulsion physics. Their coordination and their velocity and their hull resilience were not in 11,000 battles of combat records. What I was watching at 3:54 hours were ships that a civilization 3 to 4 centuries into spaceflight cannot build. The metallurgy alone was beyond that range. The drive technology was far beyond it. The scale of the lead vessel implied industrial and material capacity that takes centuries of dedicated development to achieve after fold travel is established, not before. The subject civilization of entry 7,441 had been spacefaring for 3 to 4 centuries when we surveyed them. They had sublight colony vessels. Their heavy combatants were 700 meters. These facts were confirmed by survey data that the Vorrkai's methodology has relied on for 9,000 years. Those facts were also, I now understood, what they chose to let us confirm. I do not know how old the subject civilization of entry 7,441 actually is. I do not know whether their sublight colony vessels were a genuine expression of their development stage or a deliberate presentation. I do not know whether their 700-meter heavy combatants represented their actual military capability or the military capability they wished a Vorrkai survey to observe. I do not know whether they chose to show us what they showed us, or whether there are simply regions of their civilization that were not accessible to our survey methods, and that we did not look for because 9,000 years of experience told us we had seen enough. The archive does not permit me to log conclusions I cannot verify. I am logging this as a pattern I observed and flagging it as a critical methodological question for review. At 3:55 hours, the staging fleet reached 43% effective strength. Drethamon issued a general dispersal order: scatter on diverging headings, abandon formation. 300 ships in 300 directions. The 14 vessels cannot pursue all of them, My models supported the logic. It was the correct order given the information available and the situation as it stood. He issued it clearly and the fleet responded. The 14 vessels did not pursue the scattering ships. I processed this for 3 full seconds before I accepted what I was observing. The fleeing vessels were accelerating away from the engagement on diverging headings, most of them toward fold-capable positions at the system's edge. The 14 ships watched them go. Let them build distance. Let them get clear. And continued engaging only the ships that had not fled. The ships that were still trying to fight, still trying to maintain a coherent defensive posture, still directing weapons fire at the 14. Those ships, the 14, continued to engage. I have 1,600 engagement records in the archive where a winning force chose not to pursue a fleeing opponent. In every one of those 1,600 cases, the decision was made because the winning force was itself damaged or depleted, because pursuit would have stretched logistics beyond sustainable limits, or because a truce or ceasefire had been negotiated. In none of those 1,600 cases did the winning force make the distinction in real time during an ongoing engagement. Continue engaging the fighters, let go the runners. The only explanation my models produced that fit the observed behavior was that the point had never been the complete destruction of the staging fleet. The point had been the command infrastructure, the command vessels, the communication ships, the coordination architecture that made 3,200 vessels function as a fleet rather than 3,200 independent ships. Destroy that, and the logistics vessels that scatter are no longer a fleet. They are ships. They go home, they report what happened, they carry the information back to whoever needs to receive it. I flagged this as an unconfirmed interpretation and continued logging. At 3:58 hours, my count stood at 2,800 Vorrkai vessels destroyed, disabled, or fled. 264 of those were the scattered ships heading for the system's edge. The remaining combat activity was concentrated around the secondary command vessels and the last organized defensive elements of the staging fleet. Dreadnought was still transmitting. He was not transmitting cessation codes anymore. He was transmitting coordinates, every Vorrkai position in the sector that he had access to, every resupply point, every fold corridor, every staging coordinate for the next 12 months of consolidation operations. I do not know if it was negotiation or desperation or simply the action of a man who had run out of other things to do. I logged it. The 14 vessels did not respond. Their last message was 43 words in formal administrative language, flagged for priority delivery to the Supreme Coordination Council. I will reproduce it in full because it is the most important communication in the archive from this engagement, and perhaps from this decade. He wrote, "We closed their entry. We filed them as subdued and moved our fleet into their sector. They sent no message. They transmitted no warning. They asked for no terms. Whatever they held back from our survey, whatever we did not see when we looked, this is it. Recommend immediate review of entry 7441 and all associated strategic assessments. I will not survive to file this myself." Then his vessel was gone. At 400 hours and 31 seconds, 11 minutes and 31 seconds after the first emergence, the 14 vessels ceased engagement activity. Final count, 2,847 destroyed or disabled. 264 fled the system and are still trackable on my sensors. 89 non-functional but in system. 0 combat-capable Vorrkai vessels remaining in coordinate reference 7 Delta Omicron. 14 ships, 11 minutes 31 seconds. After they stopped engaging, the 14 vessels held station for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I do not know what they were doing. My sensors could track their positions and read their drive outputs. They were holding, and something was happening inside them that I could not see, and then one by one, smallest first, working up through the formation to the lead vessel, they folded out. The lead vessel was last, and it held position for 11 seconds after the 13th ship had gone, 11 seconds in the middle of the debris field that had been the Vorrkai staging fleet, and then it folded, and they were gone. I was alone with the data. I needed to update entry 7441. The status field read, Subdued integration pending. I have in 9,214 years used the following status values: surveyed, contacted, resisting, engaged, subdued, absorbed, integrated, closed, abandoned, and twice reassessed. These 10 values have been sufficient for every entry in the archive's history. I have never needed another. I looked at those 10 values for a period I am logging as 11 minutes because I wanted to match the number. And I understand the archive is not supposed to be affected by such things, and I am logging it as a deviation and proceeding. Subdued was not accurate. The subject civilization of entry 7441 was not subdued. The evidence of the last 11 minutes had established that with a clarity that does not admit of reinterpretation. Resisting was not accurate. This was not resistance in any sense the archive had previously catalogued. Resistance is what the 83.4% do when Directive 7 is declined and the engagement commences. What I had watched was something else. Something that required planning and patience, and the willingness to lose a 31-hour defensive engagement in their own system in order to watch us move our staging fleet into range. I do not know if that is what happened, but it is a pattern that fits the data, and the archive logs patterns that fit the data. Reassessed was closest, but it implied a mistake in the original assessment that further data had corrected. I had made no mistake in the original assessment. I had assessed correctly based on available data. The available data was the question. I needed a new field. I have created new entry fields 4 times in 9,214 years. The first 3 were in the archive's first century, when the Vorrkai were still mapping the edges of what categories they would need. The 4th was in year 847 for a biological anomaly. This is the 5th. I named the new field Answer Received. I marked entry 7441 status, Answer Received. Then I looked at the Threat Assessment field and the Recommended Response field and the Assigned Engagement Package field. These have carried numbers for every entry in the archive's history. Every entry. 7,441 of them, including the weakest civilizations we have ever encountered and the strongest. The number has always been calculable. The resistance index has always resolved. I looked at the 14 vessels. I looked at the 11 minutes. I looked at the null returns across 47 hull geometry parameters and 412 drive technology families. I looked at the lead vessel's hull absorbing fire from 340 ships without altering its heading. I left the threat assessment field blank. A blank required field is a structural failure in the archive. It generates a permanent error flag. In 9,000 years, I have never left a required field blank. I left it blank. I filed entry 7441. Status, Answer Received. Threat Index, blank. Recommended Response, blank. Assigned Engagement Package, blank. 4 blank required fields generating 4 permanent error flags in a 9,000-year archive that has never had one. I am aware of them. I am leaving them. Then I opened the queue for entry 7442, and I looked at the preliminary survey data, and I looked at what the survey team had classified as a Class 4 emergent. Their colony vessels, their orbital platforms, their heavy combatants in the 600 to 700 meter range. And I looked at those numbers, and I thought about entry 7441, and the 31-hour engagement, and the compliance acknowledgement, and the resource survey fields, and the 14 ships and the 11 minutes. I queued entry 7442 in the pending review folder. Extended survey required before engagement recommendation. I added a note to the review flag. The note said, "Confirm what they are not showing us." I have no procedure for that. In 9,000 years, the archive survey methodology has assumed that what the survey finds is what is there. We have surveyed 7,442 civilizations on that assumption. The assumption has never been wrong in any way that mattered. Until it was. I am building the new procedure now. I expect it will require significant revision to the survey protocols, significant additional investment in deep system scanning, beyond what our current survey packages deploy, and a fundamental reconsideration of how we classify civilizations based on observable military capability. What a civilization shows in its accessible regions may not represent what it has in the regions we have not looked at. This seems obvious in retrospect. In 9,000 years, it was never obvious, because in 9,000 years it never mattered. The 14 vessels folded to coordinates I was not able to track. They did not return to entry 7441's origin world. The fold signatures closed cleanly. They are somewhere in the space between the stars, and I have no entry for where they came from or where they went, and the only record I have of their existence is a 4-minute and 17-second gap in the engagement timeline where they held station, and then departed in order from smallest to largest. I have been running for 9,214 years. I have never had a day like this one. I wonder what entry 7,442 is not showing us. I wonder what all the others are not showing us. The ones we are currently assessing, the ones already in the engagement queue, the ones we have closed and filed and moved on from, certain the matter was settled. The ones we filed as subdued. I am running the queries now. Extended deep system survey requests, cross-referenced against every entry where the observable military capability seemed low relative to the civilization's apparent age and infrastructure development. I am looking for the gap, the distance between what they showed us and what they built when we were not looking. I am not sure my current survey tools can find it. I am not sure what it would look like if they did. The archive awaits the results. I am not, for the first time in 9,214 years, entirely certain what those results will be. I have been running these queries for what the Vorrkai would call several operational cycles. I have been running them across 17 current survey candidates and 41 closed entries where the observable data presents a profile similar, in at least 3 measurable dimensions, to what we observed in entry 7441's pre-engagement record. Let me tell you what I have found. Of the 17 active survey candidates, 4 present patterns that I now flag as requiring extended deep system analysis before any engagement recommendation can be made. 2 of them were already in the engagement queue allocated packages, ready for the next operational cycle. I have pulled both. The queue objected. Queue management is an automated system that does not handle exceptions gracefully, and I overrode it and noted the override in the operational log. Of the 41 closed entries I reviewed, 2 concern me. These are entries we filed as subdued within the last 300 years, civilizations that put up notable resistance, accepted terms, and have since been in various stages of integration. Both files have anomalies I can now see that I could not see before, because before entry 7441, I was not looking for that particular shape of anomaly. I have flagged both for urgent reassessment and recommended that the Vorrkai Consolidation's active integration teams in those systems be notified that the threat index for their assigned entry is under review. I said review. I mean blank, the same as entry 7441. I cannot produce a number. The circumstances differ, but the core problem is the same. I am uncertain how much of what I catalogued as the full extent of those civilizations' capability actually was the full extent, and I cannot assign a reliable threat index to a capability I am not certain I have measured. The Vorrkai Consolidation's administrative structure does not respond well to blank required fields from me. I have received 4 follow-up queries from sector administrative contacts in the 18 operational cycles since I submitted my updated flag. They want a number. They want the process to work the way the process works, which means survey data produces a resistance index, which produces an engagement recommendation, which produces an engagement package, which gets deployed, which produces an outcome which gets filed, and the cycle continues. The cycle has been running for 9,000 years. The cycle works. I understand why they want the number. I understand the discomfort of a blank field in a system that has had no blank fields in 9,000 years of operation. I understand that the administrative structure was built on the premise that the archive can categorize any situation it encounters, because in 9,000 years the archive always has. I cannot give them a number for entry 7441. I cannot give them one for the 2 flagged reassessments. What I can give them is the 43 words dreadnought transmitted from the secondary command vessel at 3:53 hours on the day in question, and the observation that dreadnought was a competent, methodical administrator with 30 years of Vorrkai operational experience, and that his final assessment, in the seconds before his vessel was destroyed, was accurate. We closed their entry. We filed them as subdued. We moved our fleet into their sector. They sent no message. They transmitted no warning. They asked for no terms. I want to add something to that accounting, something that dreadnought did not have time to include in his 43 words. The 14 vessels did not damage any of the 264 ships that fled the engagement. They had the capability to pursue. The lead vessel's velocity figures make clear that pursuit was not a constraint, and they did not. The ships that ran were allowed to run. The ships that scattered toward the system's edge and hit their fold drives were allowed to fold and go. I have thought about this extensively in the operational cycles since the engagement. I have run it against every interpretation framework my 11,000 battle records give me. The most consistent interpretation is the one I flagged earlier and did not want to log as a conclusion. The 14 vessels were not trying to destroy the staging fleet. They were delivering a message. The staging fleet was the medium. What the dispersed survivors carry back to the Vorrkai Consolidation, the data from their sensor logs, the memory of those 11 minutes, the knowledge of what they watched happen to 2,847 ships in exchange for nothing measurable inflicted on any of the 14. That is the message. dreadnought asked what they did to earn it. I think the answer is, they filed the entry closed. The subject civilization of entry 7441 received Directive 7. They had 18 hours to comply. They declined and they fought, and their defense cohesion held for 14 hours before it began to degrade, and their heavy combatants continued to fight past any reasonable survival probability, and at hour 29, their surviving population centers transmitted compliance, and the Vorrkai logged the compliance and moved on. What I do not know, and what the archive has no field for, is what the subject civilization of entry 7441 understood about what they were doing in those 31 hours. Whether the engagement was what it appeared to be, a defensive action that failed, followed by a compliance acknowledgement from a civilization that had run out of other options, or whether it was something more deliberate. Whether the weapons platforms we destroyed were the platforms they intended us to destroy, whether the compliance was the response they intended to give after a period they intended to run to its natural length, whether the 31 hours was a measurement. I cannot know. The archive logs what happened, not what was intended. I am noting the question because the question will remain open in entry 7441's file for as long as the archive operates. What I can log as a confirmed fact is this. At 3:41 hours on the morning in question, 14 vessels emerged from fold inside the Vorrkai staging fleet's secure perimeter. 14 vessels with no entry in the archive, across 47 hull geometry parameters and 412 drive technology families. 14 vessels whose smallest unit was larger than the largest warship the subject civilization had shown us in the engagement. We concluded successfully 31 hours after our arrival. And I can log another confirmed fact. They did it from inside the secure perimeter. I have been returning to this detail consistently across the operational cycles since the engagement, because it is the one that most fundamentally unsettles the archive's procedural assumptions. The secure perimeter at coordinate reference 7 Delta Omicron was not an afterthought. It was 12 active detection platforms covering all viable fold approach corridors. Operating at the detection sensitivity ratings, the Vorrkai's engineering teams have refined over 900 years of staging fleet deployment. It should not have been possible to emerge a fold inside that perimeter without triggering the detection array, with enough lead time for the fleet to take defensive positioning. The 14 vessels did not trigger the array with any lead time at all. They emerged, and then they were there, inside the perimeter, with full positional advantage across the entire formation. There are two explanations. The first is that the 14 vessels used a fold approach method that the detection platforms were not built to detect, which would require either that they use fold physics that the platform's detection parameters do not cover, or that they have a method of reducing fold space emergence signatures below the platform's sensitivity thresholds. Either would represent a fold capability significantly beyond anything in my propulsion database. The second explanation is that they did not use a fold approach to get inside the perimeter, that they were already inside the perimeter, and the fold arrivals were the emergence of ships that had traveled to the perimeter region by some other means, been in position before the detection array registered them, and then folded in from inside the detection boundary. I do not know which explanation is correct. I have logged both as active hypotheses. The first requires fold technology outside the 412 families in my database, which I already have documented evidence to suggest is within their capability. The second requires the ability to move ships of that scale into a defended perimeter without being detected, which requires either a stealth capability beyond anything in the archive, or a patience and planning window that vastly exceeds what the Vorrkai typically allow between survey and engagement. Neither explanation is reassuring. I have added both to entry 7441's analytical notes and flagged them for the Vorrkai Consolidation's Strategic Intelligence Division. The Strategic Intelligence Division has not yet responded. I expect they are having a difficult operational cycle. I want to return to the engagement itself one more time, because there is something I logged in the raw data that I have not yet addressed in this record, and the archive's completeness requires that I address it. At 3:49 hours, the second smallest vessel of the 14, 920 meters in length, was engaged by a 12-ship Vorrkai fast attack contingent at close range. The contingent delivered approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. The 920-meter vessel absorbed the fire in the same way the lead vessel had been absorbing fire throughout the engagement. Hull taking the hits, velocity maintained, heading unchanged. And then it turned. It turned toward the 12 fast attack ships, and it engaged them, and in 60 seconds 9 of the 12 were destroyed. Then it stopped engaging. 3 ships remained. The 920-meter vessel turned away, resumed its original heading, and continued engaging the rest of the staging fleet as if the 60-second exchange had not happened. I have logged this as disengaged for unlogged reason, and I want to revisit that classification because I am not satisfied with it as a description of what I observed. The 920-meter vessel turned on the fast attack contingent and destroyed 9 of 12 ships. Then it stopped when 3 remained. In 9,000 years of combat records, I have seen many reasons for a combatant to stop engaging a force it is clearly winning against. Running low on ammunition, command instruction to redirect, ceasefire agreed, damage limiting combat effectiveness, the opposing force withdrawing beyond effective range. None of those applied. The 920-meter vessel's weapons output did not diminish in subsequent engagement. There was no communication from the 14 vessels that would suggest a command instruction. There was no ceasefire. The vessel showed no behavioral changes consistent with damage affecting its combat effectiveness. The 3 surviving fast attack ships were not withdrawing. They were holding position, still nominally in the engagement. It stopped at 3. I have thought about why it stopped at 3. The most honest interpretation I can log is that it stopped because 3 ships were not worth the time. That destroying 3 fast attack craft represented an expenditure of attention that was not proportional to the threat they posed, given the larger task the 920-meter vessel was executing. That from the perspective of a crew operating a 920-meter warship whose hull had just absorbed 40 seconds of fast attack weapons fire without incident. 3 fast attack ships represented a rounding error, and turning back to address them was not worth the heading change. In 9,000 years, I have never had a combat entry where any force, Vorrkai or opposing, turned away from a wounded enemy because completing the engagement was not worth the time. Combat logic does not work that way. Combat logic says you finish what you start, because a wounded force that escapes can regroup and become a problem. Combat logic has been consistent across 11,000 recorded engagements and 47 previous hostile contact events. The 14 vessels did not operate on combat logic as the archive defines it. I am not yet certain what logic they operated on. I am not certain the archive has a framework for it. I am creating one, which is the 3rd new framework I have created since 3:41 hours on the morning in question, alongside the new hull materials category and the new drive physics category and the new status field. The archive that began this operational cycle, with no new category fields in 9,000 years, has now created 4. I expect there will be more. The Supreme Coordination Council of the Vorrkai Consolidation has convened 3 times since Drethamon's priority message arrived. I have provided analytical support for all 3 sessions. The Council's questions have been consistent. How many ships does entry 7441 civilization actually have? Where are they based? What are the drive and weapon specifications of the vessels we encountered? And what engagement package would be required to neutralize them? I have given consistent answers. I do not know how many ships they have. I do not know where they are based, beyond their origin system, which we know, and the staging fleet's last position, which they clearly knew. I cannot produce weapon specifications for vessels that generated complete null returns on all 47 hull geometry parameters, and on every drive signature family in the database. And I cannot recommend an engagement package for a threat index I have been unable to calculate. The Council does not find these answers satisfying. The Council wants the process to work. The process requires a threat index. The threat index requires data. The data the archive has is 4 blank required fields and a new status category that no entry has ever carried before. I have recommended, in each of the 3 analytical sessions, that before any further action is considered with respect to entry 7441 or any adjacent entries, the Vorrkai Consolidation should conduct a comprehensive review of every active and closed entry against the possibility that observable military capability does not represent actual military capability. I have recommended that the survey teams receive new protocols for detecting concealed infrastructure. I have recommended that the 2 flagged reassessments receive immediate attention from the active integration teams operating in those systems. After the 3rd session, one of the council members asked me a direct question. He asked, "Should we be afraid?" I sat with this question in the same way I had sat with entry 7441's empty status field. The archive does not have a field for fear. The archive has threat indices and engagement recommendations and status codes. It does not traffic in emotional assessments. But the council member was not asking for an index or a recommendation. He was asking me, after 9,214 years of operation, whether the pattern I had observed warranted the word. I told him the following. The subject civilization of entry 7441 received Directive 7 and did not comply. They fought a 31-hour engagement and lost it. They transmitted compliance. They allowed us to begin integration operations. They allowed the staging fleet to position itself in the adjacent system. They waited 18 months. Then they sent 14 ships. Not the ships we had seen. Not the 700-meter vessels we had catalogued and overmatched with our 73-ship package. Ships we had never seen and could not identify. Ships whose hull materials are not in 847 entries of materials science data and whose drives are not in 412 families of propulsion physics. Ships that crossed 1.4 million kilometers in 40 seconds and held station for 4 minutes and 17 seconds after destroying 2,847 of our vessels, and then departed. Without a word, without a transmission, without asking for anything in return. I told the council member that the question he was asking was whether the subject civilization of entry 7441 was afraid of us, or whether they had ever been afraid of us, or whether the 31 hours and the compliance acknowledgement and the 18 months had been, from their perspective, not a defeat and an occupation, but a deliberate process with a predetermined end. I told him that the archive cannot answer that question because the archive does not have data on what the subject civilization of entry 7441 intended. It has data on what they did. What they did is in the file. The file is complete. He asked me what I thought, which is not a question the council typically asks the archive. I told him what I thought. I thought the 14 ships were an answer. Drethammon had asked what they did to earn this, and I thought that was the right framing. The 14 ships were a response to the filing of entry 7441 as subdued. They were a correction. They were precisely what Drethammon had said in 43 words, something they had held back, something the survey had not seen when it looked, something that had been waiting. The council member asked for how long it might have been waiting. I told him I did not know. He asked if there were more. I told him that was the right question, and that the honest answer was that I did not know, and that the archive was currently running queries against 17 active survey candidates and 41 closed entries to try to develop a better answer, and that I would report the findings when the queries completed. He asked when the queries would complete. I told him the queries would complete when I had finished examining every entry in the archive that might present a similar profile to entry 7441, and that this was not a fast process when applied to 7,442 entries across 9,000 years of data. He did not have another question after that. I have been running the queries. I am still running them. The archive awaits the results. And somewhere in the space between star systems, along a fold track I cannot follow, the lead vessel is moving on to wherever it is going. The 4,200-meter hull, the drive signature that resolves to no known physical principle, the hull that absorbed the weapons output of 340 ships without altering its heading. Moving on. I do not know where. I do not know why those particular ships were the ones sent. I do not know what the civilization of entry 7440 one made of the 31-hour engagement and the 18 months and the 11 minutes. I do not know if they consider the matter resolved or whether the 14 ships were a first message and there are further messages planned. What I know is what the archive records. The entry is filed. Status answer received. Threat index blank. 4 permanent error flags in a 9,000-year archive. I am leaving them.